Hello and welcome to the Parley podcast of The Hindu. I'm your host, Kallol Bhattacherjee. The United States is in talks with President Zelenskyy for a pact on accessing Ukraine's rare earth minerals. This development comes days after Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Foreign Minister of Russian Federation Sergey Lavrov, who met in Saudi capital Riyadh to discuss a possible meeting between President Trump and President Putin. To make sense of this fast evolving situation regarding the Ukraine crisis, which has just completed 3 years, we are being joined by two distinguished figures, Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary, and Professor Anuradha Chenoy of JNU. Welcome to you both, Ambassador Sibal and Professor Chenoy.
Thank you.
In this episode of Parley Podcast, we are really going to focus on various aspects of the Ukraine crisis as it completes 3 years. And Ambassador Sibal, I want to start with you and ask you the position that the Trump administration has taken on Ukraine. Does it appear to you that it is a position that is final from the American side, or is it part of President Trump's trademark bargaining, etc.? Is there more to that position that perhaps we are not yet reading?
Trump is unpredictable. He can still spring a surprise. He can potentially change, modify his position and take it in a different direction, depending on whether he feels that he's getting what he wants. Now, having said that, he has taken a position on Russia and has actually begun a dialogue with Russia, which didn't exist for the last 3 years effectively, and has reversed totally the U.S. position on a dialogue with Russia and on Ukraine, on finding a peaceful way out. His principal advisors, whether the Secretary of State or the National Security Advisor and others, and the Defense Secretary, have made very clear statements about their views on Ukraine, on President Zelenskyy. Trump himself has no time for Zelenskyy. He's been pretty harsh towards him. He's talked about the man being a dictator. He thinks that he needs to legitimize himself by organizing elections, which has been a Russian demand also. And he has now raised to my mind, rather odd demand that since the United States has pumped in $350 billion, that figure is disputed by Zelenskyy, who thinks that he received only half of it or even less. Mm-hmm. And he says that he needs to recover these $350 billion. And the way he will recover it is to force Zelenskyy to sign an agreement with the United States on U.S. acquiring mineral rights in Ukraine. So he reduced it to a commercial trade, economic proposition, whereas to my mind, the core issue is not economic or commercial or trade or investment or things like that. It's an issue of European security, the role of the United States in providing that security to Europe, Europe's lack of independent way of securing themselves against Russia, the future status of NATO. In other words, a redefinition of the European security architecture. Very importantly, is the first time that any U.S. president has publicly said that the expansion of NATO was the reason for the Ukraine conflict, and went on to actually give a very rational view of things, saying that if other countries establish themselves militarily on U.S. borders, U.S. will not accept it. And therefore, you understood why Putin and Russia have been opposing the extension of NATO. Now, this totally destroys the narrative that the earlier administration, Biden administration, and Europe even now continues to develop to say that no, NATO expansion is just an excuse. Russia actually, Putin is reviving his imperial ambitions. He will not be satisfied with a victory in Ukraine. He will try and recreate the Soviet Union. He will then attack the Baltic states and Poland. In any case, in terms of NATO, yes, some kind of an opening was made, but everybody was clear that this was on paper only, and there was no way that Ukraine would become a member of NATO in any foreseeable future, which is total nonsense, frankly. Because I've served in Russia, and when Putin made his famous Munich speech, I was still in Moscow as ambassador. And if you read the back channel, the book by William Burns, who was the CIA, head of the CIA until the change in government in the United States, he very clearly, more than once, states in his book that he had warned the State Department that do not make this mistake, do not offer NATO membership to Ukraine, because not only Putin and Kremlin and the Russian political establishment as a nation, Russia is totally opposed to this. And Putin has told him quite clearly that under no circumstances I'd allow Ukraine to become part of NATO. But he said that there was a hubris in Washington, and they felt that whatever the Russian reaction, they would be able to manage it. So in short, in answer to your question, I said I think that there is such a total reversal of U.S. policy, and the consequences of that in creating a huge turmoil, political turmoil in Europe, that for him now to walk back and spring a surprise in the way that he would start arming Ukraine against Russia, or allow his initiative to peter out and the talks to not succeed, would actually totally undermine his credibility.
Professor Chenoy, I want to ask you again the same question, and slightly in a different way, that what is really motivating the shift in U.S. thinking on Ukraine? Is there the internal American churning of isolationism that we often talk about United States witnessing from time to time? Or is there a cohesive agenda of President Trump in doing something definite when it comes to building peace in Ukraine?
Yeah, well, I think I largely agree, firstly, with what Ambassador Sibal said, but I want to add a couple of points. And I think that Trump does see the ground reality where Russia is clearly winning. It's gaining more ground every day. Ukraine is in a bad way. A lot of military operations have actually failed. This is like a black hole of a lot of American and European money going into this, but the Europeans obviously want to continue. So Trump is actually managing this defeat in the best way he can, one. And I do think it's related, throughout his campaign, he did have a campaign where he argued for peace. And he's got an overwhelming majority, so he has to please his voters. And third, I think he's resetting, because part of his agenda of Make America Great Again is to have new sources of funding apart from the gains that the military-industrial complex makes, because a lot of the funds allocated to Ukraine did go to the American military-industrial complex. But he wants to reset the kind of extractive nature of the US and get more profits. And in that is what was just mentioned about the deals on the mineral and getting a return of debt. He's demanding $500 billion, but part of that payback also includes, if you see what is being ironed out, the deal, it actually talks of mineral resources, of coal, also of much of Ukraine's infrastructure, that is ports and other things. Now, and it fits with what a Forbes report recently said, that Ukraine actually has trillions of dollars of this mineral wealth, but half of it has already gone into Russia because those 4 provinces, especially Donetsk and Luhansk, the Donbas area, that is a mineral-rich black earth region, and Russia already has it. And I think Trump knows that he cannot do this kind of extraction without Russian support. And so he's shifted his policy very dramatically, in a sense, something which has not happened before in the US since, in the Cold War, they did have at least diplomacy, but the last few years, they've not even had any engagement. So this is a dramatic shift. And I think it works into how President Trump sees will be beneficial to American interest.
Putin is playing his own games. He's offered large-scale investment of U.S. capital in developing rare earths in Russia. He has said that, in fact, Russia is the biggest repository of rare earths up in the north as well as in the Far East. So, in other words, he is playing upon Trump's proclivities to make a good commercial deal by saying that I can offer you a lot of opportunities. And he's also offered opportunities to him in the Donbas area. Yes. So to that extent, it's a clever move to dilute a little bit Trump's, view that Ukraine is important to him in terms of getting access to these mineral resources. The second thing is that in a way, what Trump is trying to do is to push the Europeans, as we all know, to spend far much more on defense than they are currently doing. Poland has already increased its defense expenditure to almost 4.7% of GDP and will reach 5%. Others have committed themselves to spending more, which basically means that they're going to buy more American weaponry. They're not going to buy European weaponry as they haven't done in the past. Even Germany, when they, made an 100 billion additional allocation to defense, they bought American aircraft and American weaponry. And even now, when they're saying after this election that they will add another 80 billion or something, it will also go to American weaponry. Therefore, he gains on that account. Right. Secondly, if Europe spends far much more on defense and takes its own responsibility in terms of security or more of it, then, as he says, it will release the U.S. hands and the burden on it to focus more on the Indo-Pacific and on the China threat. So in that sense, there is some kind of a method in his madness, except that Europe is totally unsettled as a result of the decisions Trump has taken. They feel they've been orphaned and they're running around like headless chicken. And they're trying to see what they can do, make a lot of noises, promise much more aid to Ukraine, impose more sanctions on Russia, but they don't have the capacity to follow up on this, frankly.
You're right. Ambassador Sibal, I want to ask you, of course, in the context of the meeting that took place in Riyadh, there is talk that President Putin and President Trump are probably going to meet in the Saudi capital sometimes as soon as the first week of March. Does it appear to you that, before, that is when the Turkey was trying to broker a ceasefire deal, which was scuttled reportedly by the US and the UK, this time a Saudi brokered ceasefire deal might get cleared? And my question more specifically is it possible for Ukraine to have, accept such a deal while suffering obvious loss of territory? Same question to both you as well as Professor Chenoy.
Well, Zelenskyy has dug his heels in. He's being very defiant. He has, in fact, in a sense, insulted Trump, or at least that's how the Americans are seeing it. And the U.S. Vice President has said as much when Zelenskyy alleged that Trump was actually purveying Russian disinformation. And he said, look, we have stood up to Russia. We've sacrificed so much, so we're not going to be pushed around by by the United States. So he's dug his heels in. How much he can do so remains to be seen, because notwithstanding his claim that he's got 57% support in Ukraine, the fact is that his support levels are exceedingly low. I can't say that this is definitive information, but I have this information from people who have visited Kiev. I'm talking about Europeans who visited Kiev and have a pulse of the situation. They say actually the two people who are standing in the way of some movement towards peace is Zelenskyy and Yermak, the chief of the presidential office, who's a terrible hawk, and Russophobe. So there will be a problem. How long can Europe continue to support Zelenskyy? The Europeans are trying to convince the Americans that that was the objective of French president's visit to Washington, to tell him that don't abandon Ukraine. That will be a big defeat on the security front for Europe as a whole, and for the transatlantic alliance, and this and that. Now, coming to in Saudi Arabia, he has two purposes. One, of course, is that Turkey has, Turkey plays a very devious game. And Russia knows it, but Russia's hands are tied because of the Black Sea and Bosphorus and everything else, and other reasons too. Now, the choice of Saudi Arabia is interesting. One is that, of course, he hopes to get much more investment from Saudi Arabia. As you remember, he said that Mohammed bin Sultan has promised him $500 billion of investment, and I have told him to make it $1 trillion. But beyond that, he wants, he goes back to the whole Abraham Accords, and they want to be able to persuade Saudi Arabia to somehow, make peace with Israel, recognize Israel, so that ITU2 and IM, all these projects can move forward. So he has more than one reason to choose Saudi Arabia. And of course, finally, Putin himself has visited Saudi Arabia earlier. He had good relations with Saudi Arabia. But at the end of the day, I personally feel that unless Zelenskyy is removed from the equation, one way or the other, there will be a problem to force a solution on Zelenskyy, because he can continue to say that I am unwilling to yield territory. It is very difficult for him, irrespective of his character and his personality and whatever else, for a person in his situation to actually agree that the whole of Donbass and the 4 oblasts can be ceded territorially to Russia is a very, very difficult decision. And there's a little there's a little gray area there, because Putin, as you know, Trump yesterday or day before, he said while Macron was there that on the territorial issue, maybe there's some way can be found out, suggesting that Russia may not actually get all the territory it presently occupies, and may have to make some concessions. To my mind, Russia will not make that concession. So some of the things are in the air. The situation is fluid, and I'm personally doubtful, though I'll be happily surprised if it happens, that Putin and Trump meet in Riyadh, as you said, in early March.
Yeah, Professor Chenoy, your opinion, please.
Yeah, well, broadly, I think that even if Zelenskyy and the EU is resisting, and the UK Starmer is there also with the same kind of position, Trump has many means of convincing all of them. He has leverage over them. Because the choice before Zelenskyy is either to agree to what Trump is putting forward, or to face complete collapse at the battlefield, because that is what is happening. And the minute Trump withdraws funding, Ukraine will collapse within a week. So it is a choice between the devil and the deep blue sea, and he'll have to take one. And I think the easier one is to go with Trump's plan, because there at least he can ask for the US with having some security guarantees for the rump Ukraine, or at least 75% of the Ukraine which is left. Plus, he can hope for some amount of deals, economic deals, and some reconstruction. So that is an issue. And as far as I think Putin is very clear, he knows this is happening. There is no ceasefire as yet. So the Russians continue advancing. And they're quite clear that they will be able to have some kind of a deal. I think there is a war fatigue even in Moscow. I went there recently, but of course, people were very tough. And they felt this is an existential kind of conflict, which they have to win. They have to have victory. At the same time, they don't want to give up too much of what they already have. So Crimea and the 4 provinces, as Pete Hegseth, said to the Ukraine contact group, those kind of lines that he said that it's unrealistic to think that Zelenskyy can join NATO. It's unrealistic to think that this territory can go back, etc., etc. And he also said we're not going to have US troops on ground. So a lot of things will be ironed out. The process is likely to take some time, but I think at this time, and also the other thing is, I think Trump identifies Starmer and Macron and other Europeans with the Democratic Party, who he curses every time he opens his mouth and says Biden's war. And after all, ultimately, Starmer sent many MPs and his entire campaign team to campaign for Kamala Harris. So Trump also has some retribution against all these. Yeah, so I think it will go through some way or the other. It might take a bit more time, but I don't think it's going to be like what happened in Turkey in 2022 April.
Ambassador Sibal, I mean, apart from all the permutation combination that we are talking about in the third anniversary of this tragic war, there is also a compelling humanitarian case for ending this war, because we are being told by both sides that nearly 1 million people have died in this war. Obviously, when it comes to, say, at least in case of Gaza Strip, there is a count of people, how many women and children who have been victims of this war in Gaza. But in case of Ukraine, so many people have died, and yet the public opinion somehow is missing. I mean, Professor Chenoy just mentioned that she witnessed in Russia that there is a widespread position, an understanding of the war and how it has to be dealt with as an existential crisis for Russia. But when it comes to Ukraine, we don't hear, and Trump recently said that Zelenskyy is actually not going for election. So we don't even know what the Ukrainian people think about this war, which is obviously taking a huge toll on them. So the question, therefore, Ambassador Sibal, is it time for the world to ask President Zelenskyy for the opinion of the Ukrainian people? What do they think? Is that something that is missing in this entire discourse, Ambassador?
Well, a couple of things. One is that the country is under martial law. So people can't express their opinion freely. One has this information which we see in video clips here and there, that there is an effort to mobilize people to go to the front, and there is resistance to that. Several million Ukrainians have left the country because they don't want to actually lose their lives on the front. Marco Rubio, in his congressional hearing, when he made his statement, he said the problem of Ukraine is not that it lacks weapons, it lacks manpower. So he doesn't have enough people to fight on the ground. And apparently, a lot of Ukrainians have lost their lives. The figure of 1 million maybe is true, maybe it's not true. Certainly, the figures mentioned by President Trump of losses on the the Russian side seem to be exaggerated from the kind of information that I have. Not that, again, I have definitive information, but the actual losses on the Russian side in terms of people killed, casualties, about 200,000. Number of wounded, I can't say. So Ukraine is fighting a a losing battle. There is no way to now actually gauge public opinion through any formal method, either through elections or in some other way to find what the public wants. There's no scope for public demonstrations for the simple reason that there is martial law. There is one other thing which Zelenskyy has done. Now, people that I know in Europe, a few of them who have actually gone to Kiev, they tell me that the game plan of the Zelenskyy-Yermak duo is to ensure that life in Kiev remains as normal as possible. And therefore, he said he was surprised. They said they were surprised that there were restaurants and there was nightlife, and it seemed as if he said one of the best meals he had ever had in his life was in Kiev. So this is part of their strategy, so that, like in the case of Russia, that people in Moscow shouldn't feel the heat of war. So he's also making sure, Zelenskyy that is, that the heat of war is not actually felt on the ground by the Kiev population, apart from whatever happens in terms of destruction of their power grid and things like that. Finally, people who are now ruling in Kiev are the Western Ukrainians, what the Russians call the Bandera gang or the neo-Nazis. There is a kernel of truth in this. There is a kernel of truth in this. And these are diehards. They were always a problem during the Soviet times. They were a headache even for Stalin. They've always been what the Russians call terror activity in Western Ukraine, because they are of Polish, Lithuanian origin. They are Catholics. They have never identified themselves with the Soviet state or with Russia. And during the Second World War, they collaborated with Hitler. So long as these people are in power, and they came to power after the Maidan coup, especially intrinsically, they will continue to resist any peaceful settlement with Russia, unless, of course, they have no choice and they are compelled to do so.
Professor Chenoy, from the humanitarian point of view, of course, this war has gone on for so long and so many people have lost their lives. The voice of the Ukrainian people, as Ambassador Sibal pointed out, because it's under martial law. So we don't really know how the people are feeling. I mean, this is a compelling case, as Ambassador Sibal again said, that the Ukraine is fighting a losing battle. What's more crucial right now is to stop this war immediately. So apart from all the international calculations, I mean, why isn't the world in a position to stop the killings in Ukraine immediately, so that the Ukrainian people could be spared of any further devastation?
Look, the world, including India and almost all countries from the global south, China, they've all said, this war should stop, that they're willing to give their good offices. In fact, PM Modi said this is not the time of war, right in the face of President Putin. But these are decisions which these countries have to take. And ultimately, it is a proxy war of NATO versus Russia in Ukraine. So it's not a war between actually Russia and Ukraine, though Ukraine has a big role to play. It was a war which need not have happened if Minsk I and Minsk II had been adhered to, if that 2022 agreement in Turkey had come about. It was almost signed. If, for example, the Russians in the Donbass area, the 40% completely Russian-speaking people had not been discriminated against and denied their religion, their language, their culture, if they, and if Kissinger actually said it okay, in the sense he said Ukraine should be a bridge between East and West. But the US and Europe and the US at that time, the neocons had a big hand to play in the coup in 2014. And Zelenskyy, whose own election was on the platform of peace, fell into this entire trap of wanting to be part of NATO, which he doesn't have. So whatever the strategic intentions were, including of the West, or weakening, which was a real strategic intentions, or weakening Russia, of destroying their economy, of weakening Putin, having a regime change, of this massive Russophobia which exists, especially in Britain and in many of these capitals. So that led to this war, which shouldn't have happened. That's one. And as far as opinion on the war is concerned, it's the way to gauge is what Ambassador Sibal said, the fact that millions of especially women and children have left, that men are resisting and they're being forced to enter, to be enlisted. And I want to give one last example, that is of the 155th Brigade, which was made just in March 2024 by France and Poland. They spent $9 million. They trained 8,000 elite troops and armed them. And just when they went back into Ukraine to fight, about 2,000 of them were they were absent and missing, AWOL, as they call it, absent without leave. So that brigade had to be disbanded and put into other brigades. And the whole brigade has disintegrated. Most of them have been killed in a few weeks itself. Similar thing happened with Bakhmut. 180,000 men from Ukraine went into this Russian cauldron. That is how they organized their military right since the time of Napoleon. And Ukraine had 80% casualties. So the Ukrainian men have lost the appetite for this war. Of course, they are patriotic and they've done their best. But to me, it seems like a very useless war, and it needs to end.
The last question to both of you, and 2 minutes for this question, Ambassador Sibal. Saudi Arabia is playing a role of mediator in this crisis between President Trump and President Putin. Why wasn't it India in case of Saudi Arabia? Don't you think India, with its own history of peace building, could have played an equally powerful role? The same question for you, Professor Chenoy.
No, I actually answered your question in part by saying why Trump has chosen Saudi Arabia to play this role. There are three elements in it. One is that Trump has some expectations from Saudi Arabia in terms of investment and arms purchases. Number two, Putin is comfortable with Saudi Arabia. He has made a state visit to Saudi Arabia even after he was declared a war criminal.
Yeah.
So, thirdly, find some to sort of persuade Saudi Arabia by giving it this kind of importance to play a more constructive role from Trump's point of view in the Middle East. This is the larger calculation. I think India didn't really fit the bill in terms of Trump's calculations, and I'm glad that we are out of it because in fact, the moment Trump decided that he's going to have direct dialogue with Putin, our own laudable efforts to be a kind of a bridge, Prime Minister went to meet Putin. He went and met Zelenskyy and all that, trying to pass on messages to and fro. So that role has now become irrelevant because the two principals preparing the ground to talk to each other directly, and their people are in contact with each other on the ground.
Professor Chenoy, why do you think India didn't play that role or isn't playing that role?
I think I have 2 points to make in this. And one is that the cartographic kind of imaginary of peacemaking has obviously changed, because earlier these peace talks used to be in Helsinki and Brussels and Geneva, and now suddenly it's in Riyadh, which has shocked the EU and maybe the rest of the world. That's one. And second, India, I think, has played their role very well in this, as much as they could, being neutral, critiquing the sanctions, being a good ally of the Russians, and the Russians will not forget it. So I think the reset in Russia, US relations will be of great beneficial to India. Europe will be the clear loser, but I think India will be a winner. And I think Trump sees India as a close ally of Russia, and therefore doesn't see it as neutral as he does Riyadh. So maybe that's a reason, but that doesn't matter. I don't think India's out of the reckoning.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Sibal, and thank you so much, Professor Chenoy. That's it from me this week on the Pale podcast of the Hindu. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.